Hi everybody. One of the things about disasters is that it affects everybody at the same time. It affects people in dramatically different ways. We tend to think about it in terms of the danger and the damage, but in fact the impact on people's lives is so complex and takes quite a while to unfold. So much so that when people do research on the people who are most severely affected by it, and they try to relate that to various things, they find there's very little relationship between the degree of disruption or disturbance in people's lives and something like the physical loss. There's some people who lose everything will rebound quite quickly and quite well. Other people who appear not to have lost anything will find a very long and difficult process of getting through it. And if you sit down and work with those people, as I do occasionally, you actually start to understand how intricately people's lives are entwined in their community and in their networks. And that once these networks are disrupted, their lives are in trouble. I remember a fire around Maryborough, I should say, in Victoria in 1985. And one of the referrals that came through to us was a single mother with 5 very challenging kids. And she wasn't affected at all. She lived right in the middle of town, but she'd gone there after a very difficult divorce to make a new life for herself. And she set out to develop a support network of friends. She, was a person who made lots of friendships, and she had this whole support network of other people who helped her with her kids, and she helped them, and they worked together. But most of them were affected by the fire, and so suddenly they were unavailable to her. And so she's there, all alone trying to deal with these kids virtually. And then she needed to call in for professional help. And it's just a simple example to show she was a casualty of the fire, although the fire didn't affect her herself. And over the years, it takes quite a while to actually see the obvious. My privilege has been to visit many communities at many different stages of their recovery process. The first was in the Macedon area after Ash Wednesday, and I visited there for 4 years and had some sense of the process. I live in a community that was surrounded by fire on Black Saturday, and all the surrounding communities were impacted in various stages, and I visited them off and on over really, and some of them I went back after 10 years and met and talked about long-term recovery issues. So you get a chance to really watch the whole unfolding of the process, and gradually you realise that the most obvious things are staring in your face, but you don't see them, particularly if you go in looking for sort of mental health concepts. They're very important, but they're only a very small part of the puzzle. I want to just describe the way I understand this. So I think if we go back to before the disaster occurs, we have a nice organisation like this, bowls club, people come, they play bowls, they go home, they've got a committee, everyone knows where they belong, and we've got lots of different structures in our lives. We play a role, and we know how to be a husband or a wife or a teacher or a worker or farmer or whatever, and there's a structure that creates this sense of stability and certainty. And what we find is that this network of routines and predictable processes of all sorts, this social structure we could call it, is something we just sort of settle into and become part of. And it kind of gives us a framework. Come on in. You're welcome. It gives us the framework for being in the community. And it gives us a sort of predictable way of interacting with each other. And I think it functions like a skin. You know, that it's like, you know how the organs in your body have surfaces that slide over each other? Sometimes if you have an operation and you cut the skin, you get adhesions and they don't slide over each other, they join together and, you know, you get a tearing pain or something, it has to be opened up. I think we need to understand that the community structure we take for granted as long as it's working, particularly in rural communities. But when a disaster comes, suddenly you've got a massive threat and disruption, danger, etc. And when that happens, everybody except the fire brigade drop out of their roles. They drop out of the structure, they drop out of their routines, and they go into overdrive, into the adrenaline state, survival state. And what they do is determined entirely by the physical circumstances they find themselves in. And nobody knows what's going to happen, and so people go through extremely varied experiences. And I call that a moment of debonding. If you think of the social bonds that hold us into relationships, so we know how we stand, we have an attachment to people, even people that we don't know well but are a familiar part of our world. We have a sense of attachment to them, so if they suddenly leave a town or die of a heart attack or something, we really feel there's a gap, there's a hole. Even if we didn't know them personally, we feel it. So we've got this sort of deep sense of attachment to each other that we don't think about as long as we're just preoccupied with everyday life. And that extends into the family. The family are all attached to each other, and we all have our ways of interacting. We know what our roles are as the kids and the parents and grandparents and so on. And when the disaster comes, all of that disappears. It's not as though we abandon each other, but what we do is no longer organised by the relationships and all the values that we normally have. It's organised by the threat, by the disaster. And people gather each other up. But if you really listen to stories, you find that what people do in those circumstances is really defined by the physical event. So that somebody will do much the same whether he or she is trying to rescue their nearest and dearest, or whether they are stumbling around in the smoke and they suddenly come across somebody who needs help, they'll do it. You know, it's about the physical circumstances. And this, this sense of debonding, of this fabric that hold us together, momentarily disappears. And it's replaced by this flurry of improvised activity. What do we do now? And then, of course, people withdraw from the threat, hopefully, and come to, let's say, a relief centre or evacuation centre, or they go to friends or whatever. And what do you carry? You carry this huge experience, maybe with lots of horrible sights and sounds, and everyone's full of it. But what is important is, although people will talk about it, they'll talk about it in an uncontrolled way, but again, it's this, what do we do now? What do we have to do? How long before I find what's happened to my loved one? How do I get back to my house? What's going to happen next? And so you get this extended period of disorder. And pretty soon after that, as soon as possible, everyone comes together and you get this massive release of community support. People open their homes, they donate stuff, they come out and help, everyone works together. And that's a sort of rebound from the debonding. It's like you have a structure there, it suddenly dissolves, and then it's got to come back again, because we can't be solitary individuals, we must be social beings. Now, what is reformed is not the structure you had before the fire, but it's a tight structure full of energy that is based around this huge experience that everyone's had in common. The feeling is we've been through this together and we have to actually work together to come out of it. Now, I call that the state of fusion. Instead of having all the different relationships, everyone is sort of locked together in this very close set of relationships. It's a very powerful experience. There's a little town called Jindavik in Victoria where about 4 years later, when I was doing my last visit there, it's got a cricket ground that must have the best view in the world. It's right up in the hills, in the mountains, and you can look over about 50 kilometres of undulating country to the sea from the cricket ground. I don't know how they ever catch anyone out. I'd be looking down the view. But it's a beautiful little area. But the Black Saturday went through about half the town. And this woman told me that we've had the Hug Club here. The Hug Club consisted of everybody who was in town on the day. So as soon as they stumbled out of the smoke and found each other, they hugged each other. And she said, it's only just starting to break down now after 4 years. And I said, did you know these people very well beforehand? She said, not really. I knew some of them by sight, and some of them I knew, but it didn't matter. Everyone hugs each other. And then she points to her husband nearby, who's having a cup of tea and talking to somebody. She says, but I don't hug him that much. And I think that's a really important thing, because if you think the whole emotional intensity of the community coming together, often people have lots of other people in their houses. If they're not living there, they're coming and going, and people are going out and helping. It's as though there's a period where the close personal structure of the family is suddenly put aside for, bigger things. Now, I'm not saying this always happens, but I think that in the fusion, there's a continuing disruption to the normal fabric of our lives. And in the middle of it, people have had these very intense traumatic experiences. And what is a trauma? Trauma is an experience that I can't process. The word trauma means wound. So a traumatic experience is something that keeps coming back as though it's just happened. And I reckon that the best way to process a trauma is to get back into relationships where you can communicate about your experience. Now, this can happen in a post-disaster environment, but often there's a lot of excitement and people talk about bits and pieces rather than sitting down quietly and telling each other the story. One of the findings from Black Saturday is that the people that were really struggling with their mental health 3 and 5 years later tended to be people who said they had a period of separation from their loved ones at the time of the fire, of hours or days. I certainly talked to people last night who took about 24 hours before they knew what had happened to their loved ones. I think it's a really big experience, and there are other people who go through experiences of thinking, I'm not going to make it. I've come from Malakuta, and I was told by several people the story of the young man in his early 20s who went out the back of the family home, and there's a bit of a fire break between him and the forest, and he was out there with his hose, and then suddenly this huge, great firestorm comes out of the forest. And they all told me he thought, this is it, I'm going to die. Now, I didn't actually get to meet him. But if I did, the first thing I'd ask him is, what did you think when that happened to you? Because what the trauma consists of is not what happens to me, but what I think is going to happen, assuming that the worst doesn't happen. If you do get burnt and nearly die, you don't have to think about it, you went through it, and that's what you have to deal with. But there's a different sort of trauma when I think something terrible is going to happen and it doesn't. And if you ask the person what goes on, they'll often say, my mind went blank, which really means they're not looking in the right place of their mind. They're not looking in that deep instinctive brain where your survival instincts switch on. They're looking in the normal place where they talk to themselves. There's nothing going on there. And if you go down into that moment, I remember talking with a CFA crew who were in a burnover, and this guy was in the back of the truck, and they'd been very traumatised, and there was a new CFA chief came in and he rang me up and said, would you do some work with these crew? And I used to drive out into the bush and go around and talk to them all on the weekend. And this bloke was having a bit of trouble in his marriage. And he described, he and his wife and I were sitting at the dining room table, and he described this moment when he was quite sure he's going to die. He didn't think anybody could survive that much heat. Interestingly, there was only one person in that crew that wasn't traumatised. It was the driver, because he actually stayed in role doing what he was doing, and the rest were helplessly wondering if they were going to die. But I asked him, what went through your mind when you thought, I'm going to die? He said, I'm going to die and I haven't brought the wood in for the winter. And his wife slammed the table and said, you might have thought about me, and stormed out of the room. Shows that they were having a few problems. But in fact, this was a house he'd built himself, and in the centre of it was a huge Argus stove. You know those stoves that have wood going all the time? Which he'd got from an old boarding house. It was a very old stove, but it actually heated the entire house, and the water and everything was the heart. You know, he wanted to feel that he left the heart of his family's home prepared for the cold. So the symbolism was there. She unfortunately wasn't hanging around to wait for me to explain that. But you can see this is the deep instinct in this man. He provides for his family. And this is a very profound thing. Now, I reckon he probably, no one had asked him what went through your mind, and let's talk about what it means. Because it doesn't come spontaneous. You've got to ask the person to stop and think about it. I reckon there'll be a lot of people out there, from what I was hearing the last couple of days, who've had moments of encounter with their own mortality. And the real question is, what did it mean to them? And you really need the right conversation to unpack that, because what I've noticed is those thoughts aren't just like ordinary thoughts, which don't mean anything. You know, I can think, I'll throw that chair against the wall, and then I can think, what would these people think? No, they'd think I was crazy. So I don't think it's a good idea, I won't do it. And it doesn't mean anything, does it? It's not an action, it's a thought. But when you have that thought in your deep instinctive part of your mind, it's not really a thought, it's an internal action. And if you think you're going to die and get ready to die, what do? Well, I worked with one woman in a criminal event. She was pretty sure she was going to get shot by a criminal. And she said, in her mind, goodbye, Harry, to her husband of 30 years. Now, she said that with her deep instinctive being. 6 months later, Harry accuses her of having an affair because he feels she's got no emotional attachment to me anymore. She's completely debonded. She doesn't have any sexual feelings, she's not emotional, she's just completely disconnected. And being a mere male, or should I say a Victorian male, he assumes if I'm not getting it, somebody else must be. So she must be having an affair. That's the only sense he can make of it, because he doesn't remember what happened 6 months ago when actually nobody got hurt. The police resolved the criminal event, nobody got hurt. So it's 6 months ago. But the injury is in her internal sense of connectedness. And sometimes this work is very rewarding, and I explained this to her. And eventually she got it, and she eyes lit up and she said, oh, I get it, I've said goodbye, but I haven't said hello. I said, no, go home and say hello to Harry and live the rest of your life and enjoy it. She described herself as being from another planet. She couldn't connect with anyone. Now, this is a very severe example, and we probably don't see such dramatic moments where you're absolutely sure you're going to die, but maybe that does happen. And I think it's a very confusing state for people. And therefore, one of the effects of trauma is people don't come out of the debonding state and reconnect with all of themselves, only with bits of themselves. And then, if you're in that adrenaline mode, which puts you in a black and white thinking about physical problems, and your house has been destroyed or your farm's been damaged, and you think, what I've got to do is fix everything up. And then you go into overdrive and work incredibly hard for long hours until it's fixed. How long will it take to fix a farm up or rebuild a house? A couple of years for a lot of people. Some lucky people can do it in 6 months. But I reckon if you then work in overdrive for 6 months and don't pay any attention to yourself or your family or whatever, that's when we see coming in as the first year and second year unfolds, the stresses and the tensions start to build in families, in relationships, in attachments with children. I reckon one of the most important things to be thinking about at this point is to rebuild the connections and attachments, rebonding, and rebonding back into forming those structures, those roles, those habits, where everyone knew where they fitted, and we had routines that constantly communicated that we loved each other and we cared each other and we were working together. And we did it. How do we communicate that? We don't say every 5 minutes, I love you. My wife would say, what's wrong? But I have to be nice to her nearly every day, you know. I can say, you know, in the morning, I love you, dear, I'm going off to work. So it's a routine. You've got to have the code, and everyone develops their code. So there's such a tendency not to get back into that code and to improvise things and to feel as though the most important thing is the physical loss. But if you don't actually rebuild the structure of your life, you'll have a farm, but the relationships aren't working too well. I'm not saying you shouldn't rebuild your farm, of course, but it's a matter of balancing and creating this ability to have a structure that holds all aspects of your life together while you do things as you can. So I suppose my experience tells me that it's really important that people work slowly and steadily. So I think it's very important at this stage where the whole system's just starting to settle, and what people have been telling me that is that they actually notice they're having very intense moments of emotion. I was talking to a couple of farmers last night and I said, what are you feeling? And they said everything. Anger, grief, sadness, exhaustion, despondency, fear, anxiety, everything, but different times, you know, or maybe all together. Because it's a big worry. We can't see how we're going to go through. Uncertainty is the loss of that structure. I can't see how things are going to work. So I think one of the very important messages, I think it's a very important message for governments to understand, is this message, we're in there with you. There are services here to help you through. But we're talking about people who normally don't ever use services. Most people don't use services. In fact, we're proud of not using services, not needing government. Even people who work for government don't use government services. But in fact, it's really important that people actually use services. There's a lot of research to say that people don't use the help that's available. In their research, they talk about help-seeking behaviour. How do you get people to seek help early on in the process? Any kind of help. Financial assistance. Red Cross has been having trouble giving money away, haven't you? You've got to persuade people and so on. It's not just, I'm not just talking about emotional, psychological people. Not everyone needs to see counsellors, but we know that a lot of research overwhelmingly shows that those people that get involved in recovery activities, meet with their friends and neighbours, join mutual help groups, put up their hand and say, yes, do much better. It protects their mental health, because every time you get a bit of help, you're getting a message about your value, aren't you? So therefore, I think really we're just entering this period where the system's coming together, and what I notice is the cleavage, the fusion state, which I mentioned, fusion, everything's joined together intensely and strongly. People are trying to process their traumas. We know if people don't talk about their trauma and they just shut it down, it doesn't go away. It just goes into the cupboard. And it's not unusual for people suddenly to find they start having nightmares 6 months later. Why? Because they get very tired and it takes energy to shut things down. Or as we lead into the next summer, people start to get really anxious because last summer is coming back to them, and so on. And second year, it's the American military found that the mean time, the average time for veterans returning from Iraq to seek help was 10 years later. What have they been doing during that first 10 years? Trying to cope. How? Probably not productively. Getting sacked from their jobs, drinking too much, going and living in the bush by themselves, feeling depressed, having their relationships break down. You know, we see them on television, these police, traumatised police, don't we, that whose lives have gone into chronic post-traumatic stress. It's the help-seeking behaviour that's missing because they're not used to seeking help. So we need to, I don't think we need to go around and saying everybody needs help. But what we need to do is build a recovery community that networks people and just draws them into things that make sense to them. Social events, information events like you're going to have shortly. Anything at all that will bring different groups of people in together and just make sure that this understanding of the psychological and social world is introduced, and this talk about all the other problems that will emerge. And the overwhelming evidence from the research shows that the best predictor of recovery, of how fast recovery is and how many people stay in the community, is not the amount of money that's spent or the infrastructure that's built. It's the measure of the degree of social connectedness that is built and the structures and organisations that are developed in the community to tackle various issues, housing problems, planning problems, and financial assistance and so on. Because it's that social infrastructure that actually makes the connection between the services and what people need. Now, I won't go on because we've got something else in a short time, but I'll just finish with one little anecdote that we process our traumas and we rebuild our relationships when we get out of stress. So how we get out of stress is very simple. It's two things: pleasure and leisure. We haven't got time for that sort of nonsense. Don't you realise my house has just been burnt down and my fire's been destroyed, so I've got a financial problem? No. If you don't do that, your brain never gets out of the stress, black and white thinking, where you can't be creative, you can't be strategic, you can't make good decisions. And a lot of people have told me that the people that rebuild quickly and they look back and say, I think I built too fast because I missed all sorts of opportunities. I've now got to live in this house and it's not the house I would have liked. Or farmers who look back. A dairy farmer in New Zealand told me 2 years after a flood, when I look back, I realised that most of the work I exhausted myself doing in the first few months had to be completely redone because it really wasn't actually touching the real issues on the farm. So pleasure and leisure. Pleasure means I'm enjoying myself. It's really important, particularly when people grieve, and there are all sorts of things. We need to actually take time out to do something we enjoy, because that means we store energy and we replace the energy. And leisure is when I don't have to do anything, and that's when I can start to tune into myself and see the big picture. We cannot see the big picture when we're locked into a particular set of... So I think those are the two things that the community can value and create opportunities for people to do. And we need a set of recovery values and ideas that circulate so that people actually talk about these things. there was a big fire in Coonabarabran a few years ago, and there's a wonderful woman out there who works for one of the rural agencies, and she seems to have the whole community in her heart. And she said, I'm really worried about this couple, and I'm talking to them and trying to get them to come to one of your sessions. And she came up to me before one of them and said, they're here. I'm so pleased they're here. And I gave my talk, and then I went back to Dunedoo had a fire. Do you know where Dunedoo is? It's where the black stump is, although I believe there's other black stumps. Anyway, there's one in Victoria, but the New South Wales black stump's just outside of Dunedoo. And I had this meeting there, and this woman came. Now, the people from Coonabarabran didn't come to my meeting, but she came up to me after and said, let me tell you this. Since you had your meeting there, this couple have set aside Sunday morning, and they get up, they bought bicycles, they ride their bicycles into town, and they go to this nice organic type alternative cafe and have a beautiful breakfast and sit in the sun, read the paper and drink coffee, and then after an hour or two they ride their bikes back and spend the rest of the Sunday just relaxing. They've carved that out and they're looking happy, she said. You know, it's very simple, isn't it, to make that commitment to hold the values in your life. Otherwise they erode, and to restore. Now, look, I'll leave it there, but I wonder if anyone's got any thoughts.